Have you ever wondered what it would sound like if Willie Hutch and Isaac Hayes joined forces to create the ultimate Blaxploitation film score? Well, I have. And while I would never compare myself to those two legends, their iconic styles are what came together to help me create this sample. In this breakdown, I'm gonna show you how I blended the lush, soulful arrangements of Foxy Brown with the dramatic energy of Shaft to create a sample that feels like it came right out of a 70s movie scene. Let's get into it. Let's start off with the first instrument that I used in the A section for this sample. Now, as usual, I don't typically have access to a guitar whenever I'm making a sample like this, but I'm really big on using what you have at your disposal. So for this sample, I decided to go with arcade. And then as you can see here, I chopped it up a little bit so that it worked for what I was trying to accomplish. Next up, I added some really smooth Rhodes. And for that, I went with the Lounge Lizard EP4. I really did take the opportunity here to play the Rhodes a little bit more rather than just using them as like warm chords in the background. All throughout this sample, I really wanted to sound and feel like there were actual musicians involved. Next up, I decided to go a little bit more simple and add some tremolo violins. And for those, I went with LA scoring strings. One of the things that I'm always preaching is the importance of using automation. So especially here on the strings, you can see that I'm automating both the modulation and the expression. And what that does is it helps the strings to sound a little bit more dynamic rather than sounding flat because I'm only playing single notes. Next up, I added some jazz upright bass. And for this one, I went with the basic Contact library. Now, the reason why I decided to go with the jazz upright bass rather than like an electric bass guitar sound is because here it sounds a little bit more live, which I think works a little bit better for the composition and for the movie score sound of it. And then the last thing that I did for this part of the A section was I added some drum sounds. The first one being a rim shot from Addictive Drums, and then the second one being a hi-hat. You might notice that so far, none of the clips that I've played are a full 8 bars, no pun intended. But the reason for that is I actually have a turnaround at the end of the 8 bars. So I wanted to show you that specifically and how I actually arranged that part as well. So the first instrument that I used for the turnaround was these trills. And those I got from a Contact library called Lumina. The next thing I want to show you for the turnaround is this piano. And for that, I went with Addictive Keys. Now, when it comes to the effects on the piano, one of the things that I really wanted to do here was make it sound really old. So the first thing that I did was I actually played the piano at a much higher octave than I needed it to be in the sample. I took that and then I pitched it down with this sound shifter plugin. And then the last thing that I did was I narrowed the stereo field so that it could sound more mono in the mix. So now once I bounce that down and play the piano back in the sample, it has a much more degraded sound, but in a good way. And doing it like that helped me to get that old recorded piano vibe much better than playing the piano at the right octave and then trying to use a tape saturator plugin on it. Another thing that I wanted to do for the turnaround was add a melodic phrase in order to make it stronger. So I went with 2 different French horns and then I played them at different octaves. Now, one of those I got from the basic Contact library, and then I ran it through the Red 3751 plugin just to get a little bit of warmth and saturation on it. And then the second one, which is kind of acting like a layer underneath it to make it sound a little bit bigger, is just the Epic horns from Nexus. So now here's what the full A section sounds like with the turnaround. So like I said at the beginning of the tutorial, my goal here was really to try to recreate that sound and that feeling that you would get from listening to Blaxploitation film music, which means that I really had to try to stay in the mindset of the fact that there were actual musicians playing each one of these instruments. And so from time to time, you'd hear some of the musicians on these songs start to improvise and add a little bit more magic in the background. So I tried to do something a little bit like that by introducing this flute. So as you can hear, I didn't really go overboard with it, but it does add a little bit of extra magic and make the composition sound a little bit more alive. And for the flute sound, I also went with the Lumina Contact library. Now, as far as effects are concerned, I didn't really do all that much other than EQ. But one thing that I did do was I used the pitch wheel on the keyboard in order to get the flute to have that dip. Another thing that I did in the B section was I let the piano player come in and add a couple more accent chords. I just love those chords for how soulful and jazzy and dramatic and magical and ethereal they sound all at the same time. Now for the turnaround on the B section, there's two main things that I want to show you. The first is this ridiculously smooth lead that I added to kind of layer underneath the French horns. And for that, I went with the Selena V2 with a couple of tweaks here and there, but really as far as effects, I just used some EQ. And then there's one last thing that I added on the turnaround for the B section, which is this clavinet that I'm really using to accent the Rhodes and the piano. And then to get the right vibe, I ran it through Guitar Rig. And actually I lied, there is one more sound that I added to the turnaround on the B section, which is these horns. And again, I'm using that as an accent in the turnaround for the chords to the Rhodes and the piano and the clavinet. I went with session horns for those. So now here's the full B section. Now, we've gone through the A section and we've gone through the B section, but for this sample, I really wanted to think like a composer. So I did add one more piece at the end of the composition to give it more of a sense of finality. In fact, if you're a producer and you're familiar with sync licensing, then you might think of this as more of like a stinger. So first up, I had the Rhodes. So as you can hear, I'm still kind of improvising, and the reason why I'm doing that is because if I'm thinking about this as a band or an orchestra or just a group of musicians playing together, I'm kind of imagining the keys player's ego kicking in and not necessarily wanting the flute player to be the one to have the last word in terms of improvising on the sample. Next, we have this piano. So the piano player is pretending that he's behaving himself at the end of the song, but he's playing this G911 chord to add some suspense and tension to the end of it that feels a little bit more unresolved. Then I added the clavinet. And now we get back to the flute player, who's definitely going to behave himself because he got his solo earlier on. I guess not. And then the drummer also decided to add his 2 cents in at the end of it, but I'll let you hear that when I play the full sample. So this sample is a part of an upcoming project that I worked on called Sugar and Steel that's going to be releasing on January 28th, 2025. So if you're looking for an entire sample pack that has the same lush, soulful 70s vibe, then you're definitely going to want to check it out. And before you go, I also have something free for you, which is a free mega producer suite that has nearly 100 sounds and samples in it. I packed it with a bunch of sounds that you would need to make your next masterpiece, like 5 free sample packs, all from different genres, melodic one-shots, drum loops, and even more. Just hit the link in the description to download that, and I'll catch you next time.